Onorevoli Zrinzot Soppardi u Sinjuri, merħba lil kulħadd. Din il-pubblikazzjoni ġdida tagħna ilha ġejja. Fil-waqt li kburin bil-programm artistiku tagħna u bl-impenn għall-eċċellenza li stabbilixxejna lina, ridna niċċelebraw din il-binja stess, il-karatteristika distintiva tal-investiment nazzjonali fl-arti kontemporanja. L-istorja tal-MICAS naturalment mhijiex biss din il-binja. Hija dwar l-idea li nedejna għal dan il-mużew. Il-ħolma tagħna kienet li nagħtu l-arti kontemporanja Maltija, id-dar li verament ħaqqa, imma li għal 20 ta' snin ma kellniex. L-isfida tagħna kienet li noħolqu istituzzjoni li tonora kemm il-pis tal-passat għani tagħna, iżda b'vuċi soda li toħodna fil-futur. Ridna istituzzjoni tas-sew Maltija, iżda waħda li tkun fi dialogu sostnut mad-dinja usa tal-arti kontemporanja. Ridna binja li verament tikkomunikalna l-qawwa ta' trasformazzjoni arkitettonika. U ridna tip ġdid ta' konfront artistiku waħda rrikkita bil-pajsaġġi ħajjin ta' dan l-ambjent mediterranju. Tassew kif Dr. Georgina Portelli tikteb f'dan il-volum impressjonanti. Ridna li l-MICAS jipprovdi sens ta' ħolqien ta' postijiet, placemaking, fejn l-esperjenza kulturali tkun imsejsa anke fuq l-arfin soċjali u ambjentali. Fil-wirja tagħna Beyond the Bastions, intraċċajna linja diretta mal-ġenesi ta' dawn il-bastjuni. Meta ngħidu li l-MICAS ħareġ mill-ġebla Maltija, huwa l-fatt li l-bini tal-mużew żvela saffi ta' storja li llum saru spazji jospitaw l-aktar arti kontemporanja ambizjuża. Iżda, effettivament, il-MICAS jagħti enerġija mill-ġdid lil din l-art li l-ewwel ġiet imsawra għal finijiet tad-diviża biex illum sar post għall-immaġinazzjoni u għall-kreattività. Biex wasalna hawnhekk illum kienet meħtieġa rieda kbira, anzi twemmin f'dan it-trasformazzjoni u fil-benefiċċju li dar għall-arti kontemporanja bħal din tista' tipprovdi lil din il-gżira. Illum, nirringrazzja lil dawk kollha li fl-2013 inaqdu miegħi biex jappoġġjaw din il-viżjoni. Jien nħares lura dawn is-snin kollha. Nixtieq nirringrazzja lill-Gvern Malti għad-deċiżjoni tiegħu li jagħmel din il-viżjoni realtà u li jkompli jappoġġja. U nirringrazzja lill-membri kollha tal-bord tal-MICAS, passati u preżenti, u lil ħaddiema kollha tal-MICAS talli kienu parti minn dan il-vjaġġ. Inħobb ngħid li l-MICAS hija calling card għal din l-ambizzjoni Maltija tagħna fid-dinja internazzjonali tal-arti. Fiduċja nistqar li l-kuraġġ ta' viżjoni tas-sew isawwar l-ambizzjoni u dan il-volum jiżgura li l-istorja tagħna tibqa' għaddejja. Grazzi, issa nixtieq nistieden lil Dr. Georgina Portelli għall-preżentazzjoni tagħha.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening. As the Chair rightly points out, this publication indeed marks an important milestone for MICAS and for the wider cultural landscape in which it has taken shape. Edited by Marco Mulazzani, Professor of Architectural History at the University of Ferrara, and published in collaboration with Electa, a leading Italian publisher in architecture and the visual arts, whose architectural program is directed by Francesco Dalco, the volume offers a considered account of MICAS as both an architectural transformation and an institutional proposition. The book traces the evolution of the site from fortified terrain to contemporary art campus through contributions by Carlo Terpolilli, Conrad Buhajar, Niccolò De Robertis, Edith Devani, Guillaume Dreyfus, and the Restoration and Preservation Department. It examines the design logic of the building, its conservation strategy, and the thinking that shapes the museum's identity. Although Carlo Terpolilli is unfortunately unable to be with us this evening, his architectural vision remains central to both the museum and to this volume, We also acknowledge the wider architectural collaboration, including that of Mariello Spiteri of EMPD and the Restoration and Preservation Department led by Perit Norbert Gatt. The publication considers MICAS through the lens of architectures of connectivity, spatial, historical, and institutional, and asks how heritage might be experienced differently. It explores how the fortified site is not simply preserved, but reactivated, how historical layers coexist, and how contemporary art operates within this charged terrain, shaping the visitor's encounter through spatial progression rather than linear display. In this way, the museum is understood not as a neutral container, but as a designed cultural setting where artistic practice and architectural space enter into dialogue. The ideas articulated in this volume have developed alongside MICAS from inception, informing its curatorial direction and its architectural conception as a site-responsive cultural framework, architecture as inseparable from site. More than documenting a new institution, this book positions MICAS as a case study in contemporary museum thinking, one that engages heritage without nostalgia, advances contemporary artistic practice within a historically layered site, and most importantly, affirms cultural continuity within a context shaped by circulation and exchange. Therefore, this volume stands both as a record and as a proposition, a reflection on what has been achieved, and an invitation to consider what a contemporary art institution can become when architecture, conservation, curatorship, and place are understood as inseparable. I would like now to extend our sincere thanks to the editor and contributing authors, to the photographers whose image shaped the visual narrative of this volume, to the Electa team led by Giovanna Crespi, and to the MICAS team, particularly Guillaume Dreyfus and Yves Cox, whose dedication to research and editorial preparation has been central to bringing this publication to fruition. Thank you. I now invite Chanel Buzetti from Restoration and Conservation Department to share her reflections.
Good evening, everybody. I promise to keep this short, 3 minutes, just like they said, which would be impressive because the book we're launching today covers 10 years of uncharted territory, 4 phases of a complex project coming together, several lifetimes, both past and present, a pandemic, and language and culture barriers unheard of since the construction of the Tower of Babel. MICAS began when a group of very optimistic people looked at an abandoned fortified ditch full of wild, stony, uneven terraces, collapsing into a network of underground tunnels, battered by substantial World War II damage, possibly 1 or 2 ghosts, and even Restoration and Preservation's own warehouse of materials gathered over 2 decades of restoration works. And when they looked at it, they said, yes, this will make the perfect contemporary art gallery. And instead of running away, the team at RPD said, great idea, let's do it. And here we are today, celebrating not only MICA's vision, but also the story behind it, captured beautifully and bravely in this publication. The book reflects the work of the team at RPD, my colleagues and directors, many of them here, who are frankly unstoppable. A team who can rethink a ditch, redesign connections to a marina, save rock outcrops, reimagine public spaces, apply for EU funding with an internally designed concept, engage through public procurement an integrated design team for specialist support, engage again through public procurement a contractor to take on everything from excavation to finishes, simultaneously restore circa 25,000 meters square of stone, and find the energy to argue about the punctuation while drafting the article we co-wrote for this publication. It also celebrates the wonderful collaboration between RPD, the MICAS team led by Phyllis, IPO Studio, the PV joint venture, and the many specialists, architects, engineers, draftsmen, surveyors, machine operators, and project managers involved in floating a giant structure above a fortified ditch without disturbing centuries-old casemates. Together, we transformed the ritirata built for defense into an Instagrammable gallery. Today, we celebrate the entire journey, The challenges, the breakthroughs, the breakdowns, the teamwork, and the occasional moment when someone said, we'll fix it in phase 5, even though phase 5 didn't exist. And yet we made that happen too. Most of all, we celebrate the journey from here on. MICAS is all grown up, and I can't wait to see what story this gem will come up with next. I pass the floor to Perit Conrad Buhajar, who was also a contributor to the publication.
Good evening, Honourable Minister, Phyllis, Georgina, ladies and gentlemen. If you'll allow me, just a little personal note, and I'll be brief. As I went through the book, okay, we contributed to the book. I wrote the article with Guillaume. Obviously, I wasn't in view. I didn't have in my head the final product. But as I looked through it, I realized how much I owe to the Italian view on architecture and conservation. I studied in Rome. I landed there when I was 22 in 1982. And I had the great luxury of studying in a school which was directed by a man called Renato Bonelli. Probably most of you haven't heard about him. He was an architectural philosopher who followed Benedetto Croce and who believed in the spiritual nature of architecture. And he wrote a book in 1959, which is the year when I was born, called Architecture and Restoration, Architettura e Restauro, in which he based the whole curriculum of the school, which was at that time quite innovative, because we're talking about modernist times where people were obsessed with dividing activities, industries, species in boxes. So architecture and restoration were two separate activities which did not overlap. And what he did far back in 1959 was to break that boundary. So it's already almost a postmodern view of the world where the spaces where different activities and different professions overlap can produce better projects. So in this book, which, as I said, was the fundamental spirit of his course and which I carried with me all my life because it became the basis of the work that we did in our office when I came back from Italy, was that to be a good architect, you've got to be a good historian and restorer, and to be a good restorer, you've got to be a good architect. A theme which eventually was picked up many years later, in 2004, to be exact, by one of the world's most important contemporary architects, Rem Koolhaas, who wrote a book called Preservation is Overtaking Us, because his understanding of architecture at that point in time suddenly began to understand that preservation and conservation is becoming as important as architecture, especially because the world of conservation began to extend its scope. In the 19th century, only buildings which were monuments and had artistic and historic value began to be preserved. It then, through John Ruskin, the idea of the social importance of these buildings began to give value to them, and therefore they deserved preservation as well. At first, it was buildings which were 2,000 years old, which needed to be preserved. By the 19th century, 200 years old. By 1930, 50 years old. By 1960, 20 years old. And now we've reached a stage where, if we're lucky, we build a building, and the minute it's ready, we preserve it because we love it so much. And I think this is the success of this building. It's a building which looks at its context. It has nothing to do with its context, in fact, but it has everything to do with its context. The lines are totally disengaged from the lines which were created by the need for retreat, for defense, for attack, and have created almost like a sky above what our ancestors have built, creating a building which is kind of upside down because it's like flat on top and higgledy-piggledy below, and giving a new life to something which was born for a different reason. So, in a funny way, this building encapsulates everything that Renato Bonelli, I think his books weren't translated into English, which is why so very few people talk about him. He invented this word called restauro critico. This is really the product of a critical vision of restoration, which is to understand the sites that you're in and then to add something which will give it a new lease of life. So I really would like to congratulate all those who were involved. Or if you kind of read the book, you understand how Italian it is. When we had this conference, I don't know when it was, 3 months ago, and I was speaking to Stefano, I told him it's really amazing how even the language is so interesting. He don't say we made the choice. He says the choice fell on this. It's as though everything was preordained. And that is when you know that a building is successful, when it has this feeling of timelessness, that something was there forever, even though we have extracted it from the abstract of the future. Thank you very much.
Well, just thank you for joining us. I wish you to enjoy the rest of the evening. Thank you.